So, yes, any questions to start?
This is more of a comment than a question. I was struck by your thing showing the funding of the different programs, because I once did I'm a librarian here, and I once did a chart like that of the funding of, for the book budgets or the materials budgets for the library, and it showed the same thing, through the later 90s of those same, all the increases that we got each year went to the health sciences and the physical sciences next, and then everything else pretty much stayed the same. But when you talk about looking at things like enrollments rather than majors, I was also struck many years ago, I think it was about 25 years ago, the University of Rhode Island did a very thorough study of the funding in the university and where the money came from and where the money went. And they were struck by the fact that it disproved the idea that the sciences bring in money to the university because they get all the so much of the outside funding. Because when they looked at actually enrollments and the funds and what it costs to actually to run the university, they saw that it was actually the departments like history and English that paid for themselves. And it was only a couple programs in the sciences that actually paid for themselves with the outside funding. But most of the rest of the university, especially the sciences, were money losers overall. And this would there was not much made of this whole thing, and I don't know what effect it had. The only reason I know about it is someone learned about it and wrote an article in the Chicago Tribune shortly afterwards about it, and otherwise it had no echo in any other literature I know about, and it's an amazing thing.
Well, it's the core taboo topic around research. Private universities lose 12 cents on the dollar for extramural funding, and public universities lose twice that. So for every dollar that comes in, 24 cents of it comes from inside, and some of that money comes from student tuition, and many of those students' tuitions are going to workload in non-STEM fields that don't have access to those resources. So like I was saying, I think the first step is saying exactly what you just said and saying it in public venues and really pushing a conversation about it that is about 20 years overdue.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, Chris has written about this extensively, starting with, I believe, remaking the public university. So I'll start with, or I'll follow with a question. A lot of the conversation in the morning, Chris, and even Jean's paper has been about going out into the community, public humanities. And I was really struck by your virtuous circle, because it did include the importance of getting research to the public and then also incorporating what are seen as larger public societal interests and the absolute centrality of the forms of humanities knowledge that you're emphasizing to larger projects that extend out into the public and society. But I guess one question I had listening to you, I'm profoundly inspired by the way that you talk about the importance of humanities research and taking it seriously and funding it. But I'm just wondering, just given the conversations that we've had here thus far, how you think about the relationship between, I guess I would say, scholarship within the humanities and in the university, and scholarship that is more publicly oriented, or whether you see that as, you know, a false opposition, but it is part of making the case. Does that tension come to the fore in making the case that you're arguing for?
Yeah, I think they're both important, but I think we can't credibly do public programming without money internally. And I also think that there's a huge ethical problem with the underfunding of us that it correlates to what we're trying to do with public communities. And by that I mean, we're basically underserving, you know, a new generation of students that is, you know, a minority majority in all of my classrooms in the 2010s at UC Santa Barbara, formerly the sort of one of UC's white campuses, in what was formerly a white major, and it no longer is. What we've been seeing over the last 30 years is a lot of growth in attendance and also completion for students of color that has been coupled with flat to falling per student resources being given to those students. So on the one hand, we're being asked to show our worth by working in the community. On the other hand, we're not given the resources to do the intellectual development that is our primary job for the same kind of students who have wound up in our classrooms. So I think we need to, I'm kind of a home economics person. You know, I sound like I'm always the plumber at the party, but you know, we really need to build an internal strength so that we are in a better position to help other folks on the outside.
So thank you both. I wondered, early on in your talk, Jean, you were talking about your early recognition that the problem lies within. That is, part of what was needed was changing the faculty, and so investing in ways of giving new opportunities for faculty to tool up, et cetera. And it seems to me both of you are concerned with the ways in which we need to transform what we study, how we study and teach. And I was wondering maybe if I could get the two of you to each speak to that a little more concretely. And so I'm thinking, you know, Chris, in your conversation about making our disciplines more intellectual, I'm still curious about exactly what that means and maybe what that means in relationship to some of what Jean was saying.
Okay, I'll try. I think I like to think about them as being a kind of a similar process. So we did a lot of one of our. Well, I could give two examples. One is we did a lot of workshopping around public writing for faculty who actually did want to do more public-facing writing, and one of our sort of medieval literature scholars really wanted to do it, and she wanted it in her graduate classroom, but she hadn't done it. So she was a part of the workshop. She assigned, you know, that kind of work, but it was how to take, you know, her very particular and sort of narrow area of research, and she ended up publishing on our Humanities website blog, and in a way that sort of demonstrated for her students how to do that. So it was both research and it was like translation. You can have something that is very sort of high quality research that's legible to you know, the leaders of your field, but there are ways to learn how to translate that to different kinds of audiences. And so that tacking back and forth has now been sort of built in to her classroom. One of the most interesting curricular innovation projects that came out is we have a fabulous performing arts department. And one of the things I think that we're very bad at, for example, is public speaking and thinking about our bodies in public spaces and how to present. So our performing arts department got together and spent a summer putting together a graduate course that takes the very best of their research ideas into this and then translates it into a course for all graduate students, including in sciences, of how to sort of present research orally to multiple kinds of audiences, what your body in space looks like and does. So it was their research expertise translated into a graduate student curriculum that hopefully now those graduate students, that'll just become a part of what they do in whatever jobs, including teaching positions.
Chris, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I'm completely affirming what Jean just said, and I mean, this program sounds amazing that she was describing. I would like to have the resources to be able to do, boot camp intensity intellectual training for students who didn't ever think that they were going to either go to university or to graduate school. So what that means is funding for, in some cases, they need 4 years of classes after the BA to get a PhD, especially if they're trying to acquire languages. Meaningful language instruction. Time and money and coursework to do cross-training in quantitative methods if they want to do lit and environment, for example, or lit and mind, as a cognitive science approach, and they're wondering what they could contribute in multidisciplinary fields. They need to be able to, the answer to that is time and money to take coursework in those fields so that they understand the methods to some extent at least, and are able to work and swim in those worlds. So, I mean, I think we could price this. I think we probably need eventually 3 times more money per student than we currently have, at least in public systems. We could use Brown as a kind of a gold standard for what should happen to everyone, including the millions of students who can't go to private schools and are in the public system that is decreasingly like the premium brand that we all know we actually have money to do. So for me, it would really start just with the, cognitive and intellectual development in the classroom through, lots of work and intensive content.
Oh, I just wanted to follow up, Chris, quickly to say that I'm always so struck by the fact that we do a fair amount of this, not nearly enough, for undergraduates, but it's not starting from scratch. We have institutional examples of how these things can be done and how they can completely be game changers, and yet translating that to graduate studies has just been, it just hasn't happened.
Mm-hmm. Yes. But it can.
So, hi, Chris. This is George.
George, hi.
How you doing?
It's been years.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about a narrative that's in my mind in relationship to how the culture and how the society changes in terms of its support. Because the narrative in my mind has to do with things like the space program, driving the expansion of STEM, or curing cancer as kind of an overwhelming cultural thing of why the life sciences all of a sudden take off. And then when you get to the humanities narratives that are kind of larger in the public, there are things like, even today, banning books, things like, I mean, really, closing down discourse on diversity, as opposed to saying, oh, we're going to be a multiracial future for us in 2040, and we ought to meet that challenge. And but I keep thinking that we need to commit to some kind of societal goal that a larger public can get behind. The one that seems obvious to me has to do with what seems to be a flood out of K through 12 teaching, right? Certainly in the humanities, but across the board, we are losing teachers, and we will not be able to actually sustain our public school system without an incredible commitment. When you think about that changing of culture, is that the kind of direction you head, something that has to be adopted, or are we simply going to do the same stuff we've done, we just need to convince people to fund it, in the humanities? Or does there have to be a larger kind of societal goal that then pushes forward a greater funding for the humanities.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with what you just said, and it's really well put. If this were a public talk, in other words, to, not on a campus, I would have given the other half, or, gone down the other fork, which is about humanities and literary knowledge and what it has produced for the world and what it's going to produce for the future. It would be somewhat instrumentalist. It would be about, solving, world challenges. I mentioned one really quickly in passing, which is how do you get societies to overcome racial and other divides long enough to do sort of cooperative resource sharing for decarbonization? I mean, you can imagine that not actually happening because of race. And we are people that, have, routinely think multidimensionally about all of those factors at the same time. So one thing I would love to do is develop a whole series of showcases of work that has happened already, and that's much more important or appropriate, I think, for the public-facing side that Jean and you and others have been talking about in getting communities to understand what the results of research is. But the only thing I would insist on is that it be seen as about the actual research, the scholarship, and not as something that happens as a kind of a social activity, which is too much how the public sees the university in the first place.
I just want to, I suppose, at the university, I was going to speak about enrollment, but I'll just say something very quickly about funding, which is that at the University of Chicago, the 2 units that, on my understanding, because the budget is absolutely not public, but so far as I can reconstruct it from sitting on various policy committees, the 2 units in the university that come closest, absolutely the closest to actually paying for themselves are humanities and divinity. And this is not helpful. This is actually not helpful, because the fact that you're relatively inexpensive and have low needs is actually not useful in the politics of the university. And therefore, Ph.D., the physical science division, is the most heavily subsidized by far by the center, despite its external grants. Now, just on the subject of graduate education, I will say that the way they parse out the budget, they think of graduate students in terms of stipend and health insurance. They think of graduate education in the NSF and NIH-funded sciences as paying for themselves. So in this work of this committee on graduate education I was on, the provost's challenge was continuously, why should I be paying for doctoral students in the fields where, quote unquote, I pay for them? Since regardless of the issue of subsidizing PSD and BSD, physical sciences division, biological science division overall, he thinks of their graduate students as cheap. In any event, I will just add a further plug to what was said this morning, that there's no solution here except faculty getting educated and participating in faculty government, however vestigial it is. If you're not there to do that fight, somebody has to show up for there to be a fight at all.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I would go to another point. And all these models, I came late, so I heard very little, are based on this public-private partnerships idea. And this model, I think, has in itself maybe a kind of shortcut. And this is that what the public is not really well defined. And we have here this moment where private university establishes contacts to a public that would be seen as community. But, you can also reverse this and say, I mean, what are we as, teachers in higher education are doing, I think, is already something public, because education means that we don't, give them private assets. No, we give them knowledge that is public in itself by definition. And therefore, I would be more aggressively argue that partially also private universities are public because they are educating and transmitting knowledge to the students. So the students are the missing link, I would say, between the public and the private here. And if you look at the undergraduates only as, private consumers who pay for getting assets, I think that we lost the case, because we have to see that the PhD students are an interesting medium here, because they belong both as students as teachers to the university system. So I would more aggressively argue that all higher education institutions have an intrinsically public moment, and we have to stress that we are doing service to the public, because we are, building the public in its, knowledge and its orientations, and what else you need to live in the world.
Do you want to answer, Chris? Before?
No, go ahead, Tim.
Okay,
We got to.
just very briefly, my question doesn't have an answer, so you'll be pleased to know. I just an observation, really. It's about the fact that both of these totally fascinating papers are caught, in a sense, it seems to me, on the problem of instrumentality. Chris, you explicitly sort of sidestepped the question that you were not going to talk about, which is to say, to explain the essential quality of literary knowledge, which I can, it was music to my ears, your entire talk, but you didn't sort of address that, and for good reasons, I think. And then I found Jean's incredibly instructive story about the studio lab being basically killed off precisely because it had been, in some sense, instrumentalized. It was made very vulnerable to that. I'm not sure if you'd share that sort of reading of it, but that seems to me what happened. So I just wanted to in a way, flag up that question of instrumentality, which you just used, Chris, very briefly.
So, Jean and Chris, if you'd just like to, no need. Chris, would you like to say a few final words, especially because you're so far away?
Yeah, other than just expressing my sorrow at my distance. I don't see instrumentality as incompatible with intellectual depth. That's a much longer conversation I wish I could have with you over wine later on. The thing that what happened with Jean is not instrumentalization so much as theft that needs to be, really sort of vigorously fought. And the only thing that I would say about the other comments, which I also agree with quite a bit, is that faculty should get very involved in governance. But in order to contest exactly that very accurately described narrative about how it's a bad thing if you are self-supporting in revenues and not costing the university a pile of money, because that particular model lets the NEH off the hook for having to fund not having to fund graduate students. It means that it doesn't have to provide proper overhead charges, et cetera. So that narrative is exactly the kind of thing that Faculty Governance 2.0 is going to have to wrestle with much more vigorously than the last 100 years version has been doing. The one last sentence is I think the current system is very fragile. The people that are holding it together know this, and that if in a sort of a constructive way we can offer a much more sustainable model of funding that involves the federal government in a better way, et cetera, that will get much more support than we think we will right now.
Thanks so much, Chris. We're really sorry you're not here. Thanks for a fabulous talk and conversation. Feel better. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's wrap.